A band of adventurers on a mission for fame, fortune, and maybe even a miracle. This is Sega Masters. Despite what this title screen might imply, today's game is not about the Swedish rock band ABBA, though this quartet is actually heralding the quiet dawning of a new era in the North American video game market. The Master System gets bestowed with its first fantasy role-playing game in Miracle Warriors, Seal of the Dark Lord. And while it may not be the most well-known game, this card is historical for being the very first Japanese console RPG to be released in North America. Yes, it wasn't Nintendo that introduced US gamers to RPGs like they often want everyone to believe. It was actually Sega who brought the genre to American shores, even though RPGs would obtain mainstream popularity for another decade. In the early to mid 1980s, fantasy role-playing games in North America were mainly the domain of personal computers and usually fell into one of two categories. You either had the first-person dungeon crawlers such as Surtech's Wizardry games, or you had the overhead world-spanning quests such as Origin Systems' Ultima series. Either way, computer RPGs at the time were often complicated, tedious, and time-consuming, basically made for Dungeons & Dragons stat geeks, and not exactly appealing for the console crowd accustomed to games they could just pick up and play. These type of games were virtually unknown in Japan, until Hank Rogers, a Dutchman and Dungeons & Dragons enthusiast living in Japan, changed all that. The founder of Bulletproof Software decided to introduce Japanese gamers to the world of dungeon crawling, treasure hunting, and monster slaying by crafting what is considered the first native Japanese RPG, the Black Onyx. Originally published for the NEC PC-88 computer in 1984, the title was a smash hit as Japanese gamers never saw anything like it before and quickly flocked to it. The Black Onyx would eventually be ported to the other computer platforms in Japan, and the game's success would even encourage the Japanese gaming public to start importing Wizardry and Ultima to their country. Those titles would also become extremely popular in the land of the rising sun, ultimately setting the table for the massive Japanese RPG industry to follow. Around the same time, the video game market in the East was growing behind the success of Nintendo's family computer, and the rise of RPGs on Japanese computers didn't go unnoticed by the game developers and publishers. They were inspired enough to slowly move the market away from the simple score fists of years past by incorporating various RPG elements into their creations, though they still mainly featured plenty of arcade-style action. Eventually, companies would attempt to bring full-fledged role-playing games to consoles, even though these complicated quests seemed like an ill fit for cartridges at the time. The first RPG on the Famicom was in fact a port of T&E Soft's Hydlide, which basically tried too hard to present a dumbed-down form of Ultima for the console market and is rather unplayable even for its time. But several months later came the game most really considered the father of console role-playing games, Enix's Dragon Quest, known as Dragon Warrior in the US. The creation of Yuji Horii and Akira Toriyama, it was another attempt to bring an Ultima-style quest to consoles while mixing in some Wizardry-styled first-person battles, yet it wasn't made for the 16-sided dice crowd like most of its forefathers. Instead, the game sought to streamline the template and features to be much more accessible and user-friendly to the casual gamer, a light RPG if you will. Dragon Quest became a massive success and spawned a long-running series, while also providing the recipe used by the scores of successors and imitators that followed. On a historical side note, Nintendo did almost become the one to introduce American gamers to console RPGs. They obtained the US publishing rights to Dragon Warrior and were announcing it was coming soon as early as January of 1988, but didn't actually ship the game in the US till August of 1989. In the meantime, the RPG population explosion on the Famicom inspired Sega to bring questing games to their console in Japan during the fall of 1987. As I mentioned earlier, Miracle Warriors, or Haja no Fuuin as it was originally known in Japan, was the first RPG to appear on a Sega platform, and is in fact an adaptation of Kogado Software's computer title of the same name that was published by ASCII Software for the PC-88 and other Japanese computer platforms. But the thing is, Miracle Warriors didn't get much of a chance to make its mark, since it came out on the Mark III just a month prior to the debut of Sega's true 8-bit RPG masterpiece, Phantasy Star, which we will cover in greater depth a few episodes down the line. Unlike the RPGs on the Famicom, Miracle Warriors and Phantasy Star would only need to wait 1 year before Sega brought them across the Atlantic to the North American market. Thus, the first 2 console fantasy role-playing games in the US would appear on the Master System almost a year before the NES finally received its first RPG offerings in the West. Not to mention that the 3 games in question for Nintendo's console, Hydlide, Dragon Warrior, and FCI's port of Ultimate Exodus, were already 3 years old by the time of their US releases. But just like their Japanese releases, Miracle Warriors arrived in the US just a month before Phantasy Star made its American debut and was quickly lost in the latter's shadow, causing many to forget it was this cart that blazed the trail for console RPGs in the Western market. Then again, Sega's attempts to make their port faithful to the PC original, faults and all, caused it to be reduced to a mere footnote. When you begin the game and give your hero a name, you start at this castle to appear before the king of Arukis to get your marching orders. Basically, evil monsters are infesting the 5 lands after someone broke the seal to the Pandora passage, and somehow you get called upon to set things right. Your first task is to seek out this sage who will give you more information on how to accomplish your mission. Right from the beginning you can see how Miracle Warriors tries a little too hard to mimic its computer roots. Instead of the standard full-screen overworld map showing your travels, you navigate through the countryside by following a small 5x5 grid in the upper right quadrant of the screen, which only shows a fraction of your environment. The rest of the upper half of the screen is pretty much wasted with a still photo of the hero and the surrounding terrain, which looks very nice but serves no real purpose. In true RPG fashion, you'll constantly run into random wandering monsters which you must defeat in one-on-one combat. These battles use the standard Dragon Warrior interface where you view your aggressor through your character's eyes as you select attack from the menu to get in your shot, and you earn experience points for each hit you land. Then the enemy gets an its hit, and you go back and forth until one of you perishes. Besting your foe will earn your guilders, the game's currency, and character points, plus some monsters even drop valuable fangs. Then you continue your adventuring until the next random encounter. So yes, like most other role-playing games at the time, Miracle Warriors requires you to spend quite a bit of time grinding, especially since your character begins the game with absolutely no weapons and armor at all, or even any money. However, you'll quickly discover this card takes that aspect to the extreme. For starters, while other RPGs are usually considerate enough to start you off against easy monsters in the early stages of your quest, Miracle Warriors won't hesitate to throw you against powerful beasts you're not quite ready to handle just yet. Thus your game can end just minutes after you registered your name. Assuming you reach the first village, you get a still picture of your avatar standing in front of some building window while the grid has you wandering around to the different unlabeled buildings in order to converse with the townsfolk, who somehow appear in the same window to chit-chat. Eventually you'll stumble upon the shop in the hopes of purchasing weapons and armor, only to discover that everything in this game is ludicrously overpriced, even a simple knife. Meaning you'll have to fight lots of monsters to raise the necessary funds to equip yourself. Some towns allow you to sell the fangs you've collected for a quick cash infusion, but certain important items in the game can only be obtained by trading fangs for them, so don't be too eager to pawn them off. You also have these medicine huts that will restore your hit points and sell your healing herbs you can use on the world map. Though some apparent botched translation can make this transaction rather confusing. The monk here isn't haggling, you do have to say yes to this question in order to buy the herbs. Once you're finished in the village, it's back outside for more monster hunting to bulk up your attributes and bank account. Unfortunately, many of the creatures you fight during your grinding sessions often don't drop much in the way of guilders or only drop fangs. Plus, all the damage you take from your series of battles will force you to constantly spend your scant cash for healing and herbs, which you cannot use during battles. As a result, it can take hours to scrape together enough funds to buy anything of worth. That is unless you just happen to run into these evil merchants, which are pretty easy to slay and carry quite a few guilders on them. Even if you do manage to save enough to finally obtain some weapons and armors, you soon discover another headache. Your equipment gradually takes damage as you use them in combat and will eventually break unless you constantly run back to town to pay to have them repaired by a swordsmith. Yet for whatever reason, Sega also included a way to nullify this problem. The village of Auric has this unemployed blacksmith you can hire to join your cause, and he'll continuously repair your gear for free. It's a little odd Sega would take this unnecessary step to overcome an issue they could have just simply eliminated entirely. Once you reach the settlement of Kasuma the Sage, he'll reveal more information about your quest, including the Dark Lord Terrarin, who was the one that broke the seal and caused the infestation. He'll specifically mention that 3 others are destined to join your world-saving cause, so you need to seek these allies out and enlist them by chanting the spell to awaken their powers. But of course you're only given a vague hint as to where to find your first companion and are left to figure it out from there. The other caveat is that you often need to find certain legendary weapons before your destined co-heroes will actually join you. Some can be obtained from kings by trading fangs for them, others need to be found in certain caves. The trouble is, you're never given any real direction as far as where to go or what to do for your objectives. You're basically wandering the world aimlessly, hoping to stumble onto something while constantly under siege from the monsters out to get you. And just navigating anywhere can be an exercise in frustration. Sega originally packed in this map with the cartridge that shows the game world, yet it's not very helpful since, if you'll notice, none of the towns and landmarks are actually indicated as far as their locations are concerned. Plus, only being able to see a fraction of the world at a time on the upper right grid makes it too difficult to get your bearings and know which course to set. It doesn't help that the controls are somewhat clunky and unresponsive at times during your wandering. Your trek is also constantly interrupted by the insane rate of monster encounters, and these battle scenes can seem tedious since everything unfolds through text boxes, with very little animation to speak of. At least you're treated to some colorful visuals during these fights, with vibrant backgrounds that change depending on the terrain your encounter takes place. And to its credit, the game sports a wide variety of beasts to cross paths with, all of which feature some cool, unique designs with very few palette swaps used. In a rather nice touch, you occasionally encounter good beings, such as merchants and travelers, and you can talk to them to get some sort of hint before sending them on their way. Then again, you can also choose to attack them. While the game won't stop you from bumping good merchants off and stealing their money, you'll be severely penalized in character points, and certain kings and townspeople won't deal with you if you have too negative of a reputation. The different catchy background themes are fun to listen to, from the overworld to the battle scenes, and the sound effects do their job. Should you manage to follow the scant clues you received, you might stumble into the town containing your first companion, Guy. Basically, you need to find a certain shop and chant the spell you learned from Kasuma to awaken his powers. After his identity is revealed, he'll join your party. You'll also gain a piece of a scroll that, once put together, supposedly leads you to the location of the final boss. Once Guy is on board, you have 2 more companions to search for, Medi and Turo, along with the objects and clues you need to recruit them. Now you'd think increasing your numbers would enable battles to go faster, since other RPGs allow your party to gang up on monsters. Sadly, the opposite is the case here. Miracle Warriors allows only one of your characters to duke it out with the monster per turn, while the rest of your party apparently just stands there and watches. And said person is the only one who earns the experience that round. Thus you're forced to level your heroes up one by one, which is far more time consuming than it should be. You can only imagine how long it's going to take to get 3 or 4 heroes up to snuff. Yet at the same time, the monster's counterattack will only be focused on the one attacking him, leaving your other companions unharmed, which allows for a bit of strategy given the limited options you actually have for combat. Despite the presence of a spell command, you don't actually cast spells in battle. In fact, spells are only used to unlock certain areas or recruit the other heroes. And while the retreat command sometimes allows you to withdraw from a battle, you're often told you're somehow surrounded by the single creepy you're fighting, who then gets some free shots on your crew. On top of that, some monsters, including the creatures that guard the legendary items in the caves, also have magical attacks that target all your heroes simultaneously, with very little you can do to avoid them. You can use a few magical items yourself, such as sacred nuts and earthquake staffs, and enemies don't counterattack if you use an item. Plus, all of your party members gain experience simultaneously. Too bad they can only be bought at certain locations or rarely found after battles. You can only have a limited amount stored up. If one of your pals falls in combat, you might as well just reload a saved game because you basically have to haul their dead carcass to the only town in the entire world that can revive them, and the cost is way too prohibitive to make it worth the effort. Fortunately, you can record your progress at any time with 5 save slots available. So Miracle Warrior's place in US gaming history won't be denied, and it has the ingredients of a solid quest, especially its open exploration. But its archaic PC-like design just contains too many headaches to really make the whole experience worthwhile and enjoyable. It feels like the game leans on the absurd grinding and crushing difficulty to pad out what is a relatively short quest at its core, just around 12 hours. No side quests are offered outside of finding optional items, and the few dungeons available to investigate are rather small or consist solely of a boss fight. And as I mentioned earlier, the arrival of Phantasy Star, a much more console-friendly and extensive RPG, pretty much makes this quest obsolete. Check it out for the historical aspect, but you won't be getting any real blessing from this miracle.